replication crisis in experiments, you mean? Like if somebody's got something, So this does seem to be a real problem.
And I do discuss it in a number of places in the book, because there isn't one, it's another example of a point that we made early in the conversation, that expertise is better than being ignorant, but it's no vaccine against succumbing to fallacies. And we social scientists have done it ourselves, and the notorious failures of certain newsworthy findings in social psychology, in epidemiology, in behavioral genetics to replicate is a clue that something has gone wrong. And what I often say is that this is not an indictment of rationality or the scientific method, but it's an illustration of how the power of rationality is it can always step up a level, look down on instances of itself to diagnose what's gone wrong, if something has gone wrong, and then to do better, to learn from the experience. So in the case of the failures to replicate, it became painfully obvious in, I think, 2005, when an eminent social psychologist, Darrell Bem, published a set of studies in a prestigious peer-reviewed journal showing evidence for ESP. For example, some undergraduates could predict whether which of two curtains depicted on a computer screen hid an erotic image before the computer actually decided where to place the erotic image. Now, and it passed peer review, the statistics were impeccable. Well, that's kind of an alarm bell telling you something is wrong with our standards of prestige and eminence and peer review and respectable journals, because there are a lot of reasons to believe, or as David Hume would have put it, what's more likely, that the laws of physics as we understand them have been disproved by a social psychologist showing some undergraduates some porn, or that something is wrong with the claim. And it seems more likely that something's wrong with the claim. And we know what's wrong with the claim, that there are a number of what are now called questionable research practices that psychologists are, well, anyone who uses statistics may be tempted to do, such as to avail yourself of all of the options in analyzing data, like, well, I don't see an effect, but let's look at the men and the women separately. Maybe there's an effect for the men, or maybe there's an effect for the women. Or, gee, we ran the experiment over several years, but one of those years was 2016 when Donald Trump was in the news, and maybe that messed with everyone's minds. Let's see what it looks like if we take out 2016. Well, if you give yourself too many degrees of freedom in doing that, then you can end up with some random pattern that happens to align with your hypothesis that you uncovered after the fact. And that's the fallacy of failing to distinguish a priori from post hoc probability, that those calculations can be completely different. And since the time of Francis Bacon, it's been a source of a lot of pseudoscience. Namely, if you remember all of the predictions from a seer, a psychic, a haruspicator that turn out to be right, it might seem like an amazing track record. How improbable is it that that would come about by chance? Well, it can come about by chance if you count up the correct predictions after the outcomes have happened. If you select the cases post hoc and you forget about all of the predictions that didn't turn out to be true, then you can get what seems like a spurious deviation from chance. Sometimes called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, after the marksman who fires a bullet into the side of a barn and then paints a bullseye around the hole. Now, but the painful thing about this as a social scientist is, we've always known about it, and I was taught as an undergraduate in the 1970s, you may not engage in data snooping. That is, looking at your data and then deciding what statistics to run. You've got to set the statistical techniques kind of in stone beforehand, before you know what the data are, but not everyone did that. That's one source of the replicability crisis. Another one is a failure to engage in Bayesian reasoning. of the kind that we illustrated in the medical diagnosis case, where before you interpret your positive test result, you got to take into account what are the chances that you have the disease beforehand. In the medical context, that would be what's the base rate in the population. And you calibrate your interpretation of the evidence, say the test result, in terms of how many people have the disease in the first place. If not many people have the disease, most of the positives are false positives. In the scientific context, it ought to be that before we interpret how much we should be impressed by an experimental result, we should bring everything we know about the problem to bear on how plausible the hypothesis was to begin with, and calibrate our degree of belief after looking at the data by how plausible it was to begin with, by our priors. In the case of ESP, I think a good journal editor would have said, well, yeah, the statistics check out, but given the priors, that we understand the laws of physics, at least at macroscopic scales, pretty well. It's unlikely that we're going to be surprised by some new form of energy acting on the scale of undergraduates pressing buttons. So even if the evidence looks impeccable, I'm not going to conclude that ESP exists because of my priors, everything else I know. So that's a second, I think, a failure to apply Bayesian thinking to the evaluation of data. And a lot of science journalism contributes to these, the mindset that leads to replication failures by favoring the counterintuitive, the implausible, the surprising. And I don't want to just blame journalists, because journal editors do the same thing. They are highly biased against publishing a result that seems to confirm what we already know, something that seems to be a Kuhnian scientific revolution, a paradigm shift. Everything you know is wrong. That gets undue attention. If you're a Bayesian, that's exactly what you should give the least credence to, assuming that all of our prior knowledge is not worthless. And this was pointed out by a kind of a devilish epidemiologist named John Ioannidis, who, anticipating the replicability crisis, wrote a notorious article called "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False." Now, that's a title that gets your attention. And the reason that most published research findings are false is if there is a publication bias for the interesting, the noteworthy, you don't get tenure for just ratifying what we already knew. If there's a publication bias against negative findings, we did the experiment and got no evidence for the hypothesis, you put it in a file drawer, that means that as with the medical diagnosis case, most of the positives are going to be false positives, because the base rate, the priors are that something is surprising for a reason, namely we had good reason to expect it not to happen. So both journal editors and science journalists contribute to this by a kind of perverse negation of the priors. And I think the third reason is a systematic misunderstanding of this concept that we've all heard of, that if you're a epidemiologist, if you're a psychologist, a social scientist, you use every day, and that is statistical significance. P is less than 0.05, which everyone thinks means there's only a 5% chance that the hypothesis is false, given the data that you have obtained, and that's just not what it means. What it means is, if the hypothesis is false, what are the chances that you would get the data that you got? It says nothing about whether the hypothesis is true or false. Just in the worst case situation, how likely are you to falsely claim eureka? And statistical significance is nothing but a technique to cap the number of false positives in the scientific enterprise at some arbitrary level that is thought to be vaguely tolerable. But it doesn't tell you how much credence you should put in a hypothesis. People confuse those two, the Bayesian posterior with a likelihood of under the null hypothesis. And so results that are significant are thought to be highly likely to be true. Okay.
How are our microphones working? Should we try? Great, that sounds good.
Speaking of agitprop, Professor Pinker, in the last chapter of your wonderful new book, And allow me to say, actually, whilst Chapter 10, titled What's Wrong with People, was in fact, as you said, the one we'd all been waiting for, it was a subsequent chapter that was a tour de force. At any rate, in Chapter 11, you quoted at length the famous Jeremy Bentham passage about animal cruelty, which memorably concludes, the question is not can they think, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And you go on to adduce the ethicist and animal rights advocate Peter Singer's notion of the expanding circle of moral concern. And on your rousing last page, you go so far as to say that the equality of all sentient beings is vital to our continued moral progress. So my wildly predictable question for you now is, are you vegan yet?
Am I a vegan? Yes.
If not, if so, should you not declare that to your legions of ardent admirers who might thereby follow your example and do a lot of good?
Yes. So I'm not a vegan. I think I ought to be. That's cold comfort to the animals. I am a reducitarian, so I reduce the amount of meat. So I am a morally flawed human being. Yes. So you know, why am I just not just a flaming hypocrite? Why shouldn't you all just walk out right now? Well, appreciating the arguments for why we should give consideration to animals, going back to Bentham, that is who zeroed in on the morally relevant question, namely, not can they talk, not can they reason, but can they suffer? If the reason that we ought to be, or one moral argument for being a vegan or vegetarian is to reduce suffering, which is certainly a valid aim if you think suffering is bad, then it would also lead you to propose policies that would safeguard the well-being of whatever animals are kept in farms. If you had completely humane farming, animals had air and space and social stimulation, if they were humanely slaughtered and so there was a minimum amount of suffering, that would be, one might argue that every life is precious and that animals should not have a right to life and they should not be killed. But given that the planet is not going to become a planet of vegans anytime soon, it identifies a morally valuable, at least sub-goal or stepping stone, namely, let's eliminate the suffering of the animals who do give up their lives for our meat and leather. And it is an example of how reason, although it can't determine by itself what's moral or immoral, it can sharpen our moral sensibilities, our moral argumentation. It can tell us what's morally relevant, what's morally irrelevant. It can tell us which of our practices are inconsistent with our values, and can lead to a reduction in suffering once we identify that as the key moral resource.
I think we have a question at the back.
Hello. Thank you for a lovely talk, Stephen. I was just wondering, I think it's really exciting to hear you talking about statistical decision theory. And I was wondering, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how people should choose their utility functions, how people should choose their values. If that's for people, choose their values?
Oh, their values, yes.
Exactly, yeah. Thank you.
So, there is an argument that goes back to Hume that the choice of values themselves is not rational. This, I think, is the basis of his famous quote that reason is and must be a slave of the passions, which I think, and I've ratified this with the philosopher in the household, my wife, Rebecca Neuberger-Goldstein, that what Hume did not mean shoot from the hip, live for the moment, do whatever feels good, fall head over heels for Mr. Wrong, spend your money like a drunken sailor. That's not what he meant when he said reason must be a slave to the passions. I think what he meant is that his answer to your question, namely that reason is a means to an end, and that end is supplied by the passions. Namely, we are humans, we can't help but want to be healthy rather than sick, to be respected, to be well fed, to love and be loved, and so on. And those are the passions. Now, he also noted, and of course, Hume was nothing if not, rigorous and consistent. There's no rational reason to prefer to be healthy rather than sick, or comfortable rather than in agonizing pain. So you have to, I think you have to interpret those two quotes together, that the sense of rational that he was explicating was one in which that even not wanting pain is not by itself a rational belief. It's a passion. Okay, but one could say that it's a philosophically valid argument, but only goes so far, because come on, let's get real. No one likes pain. I mean, except maybe narrow circumstances of masochism and BDSM and so on. But generally, we'd rather be comfortable than uncomfortable. Once you grant that, even if itself it is not strictly speaking logical, a lot follows, such as that if you don't want to be a target of aggression or exploitation, well, you can't very well harm or aggress against others and hope for others to take you seriously. So you do get a kind of morality, you get a kind of ought from is, not logically, since the desire not to suffer is not logically defensible, but once you grant it, then other things do logically follow.
I think you make some nice arguments at the end of the book about how, you might have a sort of axiomatic framework of morals, but then you can use rationality to tease out what the consequences of those are, and
exactly.
you show the power of rationality to do away with slavery, to give rights to women, and
well, indeed, and in the final chapter that the previous questioner alluded to, what I made an argument. I do not claim that it is a historically decisive argument of what led to the moral progress that we have enjoyed, such as democracy replacing autocracy, the granting of equal rights to women, the decriminalization of homosexuality, the abolition of slavery. And I was surprised when I dipped into the history of these moral movements, when I wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature, how many of them really did, at least chronologically, have a rigorous logical argument at the outset. Religious persecution is another example. You might think, and this was my surprise, did people really need a rational argument as to why something might be a wee bit wrong with burning heretics for the wrong theory of the Trinity, or for keeping slaves? And the answer is they did, and they were supplied. And here I also owe a debt to Anthony Grayling, his book, Toward the Light of Liberty, where he goes over some of this history. And he shows that indeed, say, Sebastian Castellio argued against Calvin and Luther, saying, well, here are the logical implication of your practice of burning heretics. What is a heretic? A heretic is just someone that disagrees with me. Well, since everyone thinks they're right, if everyone burns heretics, that means everyone will be exterminated. Likewise, Erasmus had an argument against war, saying that each side thinks that war is glorious and noble and heroic and manly. But when you think about it, any benefit that you get from war comes at someone else's expense. In the case of the equality of women, Mary Astell cleverly co-opted an argument from John Locke against absolute monarchy. Locke said, well, it doesn't make any sense that the whim of some guy who just happens to be king determines my life. You've got to set down principles that apply to everyone. It can't just be a question of the dominance of the sovereign of the country. Mary Astell said, well, that kind of sounds a lot like a family. If you shouldn't just obey the king because he's a king, why should women just obey the husband just because he's a husband? Why should she be subject to arbitrary edicts? And likewise, some of the arguments for the abolition of slavery tried to kind of hold slaveholders' feet to the fire. If you believe this, why do you practice that, which is inconsistent? That is, if you really believe that Africans have no power of reason, that you could treat them the way you treat your livestock, why do you have laws that forbid them from reading? You don't have laws that forbid your livestock from reading. Why do you have laws that have criminal punishment for slaves breaking laws? You don't do that to your animals. And so again, this was, while we might think that all of these moral movements were propelled by just moral indignation, anger, these are barbaric practices, and indeed, certainly a lot of the energy had to have come from that, but there also were arguments that told people something that you are doing now is logically inconsistent with something that you claim to believe. Now, what we can't do, and I have another chapter on correlation and causation, is we can't test the counterfactual if Jeremy Bentham had not made his argument for consideration of the interests of animals. Would the animal rights movement have unfolded more slowly? Or if Mary Astell had not made her argument. So I can't kind of tell the causal story that I would like to be true, but at least one element of establishing causation, namely showing that the putative cause at least occurs before the putative effect in time, I think is true of these moral movements. Really early on, there was a moral argument before there was a groundswell to change the practice.
Alas, we have run out of time, but I'd like you to join me thanking you for a wonderful conversation and a wonderful book. So,
thank you for